You're all very welcome. Lovely to see you all here and lovely to welcome our audience virtually. We wish you could see you and we wish we're all in a room together, but it's in the current circumstances, this is a very nice way, very nice event, and lovely to welcome you all here. So you're all very welcome to the first event of our new 5-week programme, After Effects and Untold Histories. First of all, I want to start just by introducing our speakers. So we have Jennifer Fitzgibbon, who is administrator of NIVAL, the National Irish Visual Arts Library, which is housed here in NCAD and a very integral and important part of NCAD. Johanne Mullan, who's curator of collections at IMMA, old colleague of mine, and lovely to see you here, Joanne. And Annie Fletcher, old friend and old colleague, and my successor in IMMA, director in IMMA. So it's great to see you all here. And I'm Sarah Glennie, director of NCAD. So this is the first of our events of our the opening event of this new programme, After Effects and Untold Histories, Politics and Spaces of Performance since the 1990s. And this is a 5-week online programme which has been running from today to May the 15th. It's been commissioned by NCAD and it's presented in partnership with IMMA and with NIVAL. And it's been curated by Elisa Heiss and Kieran Maloney. And this project, After Effects and Untold History, is our NCAD's contribution to a wider EU-funded project run by the Internationale Federation, Our Many Europes. The Internationale is an amazing network of major museums with education partners. And one of the things I just want to talk a little bit today, as one of the part of setting the scene, is to talk a little bit about the Internationale as a project, because I think it's an extraordinary project, and NCAD is really honoured to have joined the network for this 4-year project, Our Many Europes. I'm assuming everyone who is joining us today has found our website and seen the amazing programme that is Elisa and Kira have put together over the next 5 weeks. So I'm not going to waste time today kind of running through all the various events, but just to say, we really hope you continue to join us. There's a great weekly programme with a mixture of lectures, discussions, performances, and a great archive sort of online exhibition curated by NIVAL to accompany the project. So today's event is really about setting the scene, and really wanted to do that today through quite an open conversation with our panelists and with a Q&A, and we hope you all, and I know there's a number of members of the International Federation with us, colleagues from NCAD and colleagues from across the sector in Ireland, so we really look forward to a conversation at the end. So I wanted to frame our discussions today really about 2 areas of discussion. Firstly, to begin, just to explore a little bit with Annie, the background to the Internationale, and then the discussions that we were both involved with that has really led to this NCAD's contribution to the project with After Effects. And then to hear from Jennifer and Joanne, 2 colleagues with really amazing sort of experience and perspective on the role that collections and archives can play in documenting performance, and a lot of work that has sat outside an institutional framework and looking at ways in which that work can come back into an institutional framework through our collections and archives, and some of the challenges and issues around doing that. So we'll probably collectively all talk, we'll aim for about sort of 40-50 minutes, and as I say, leaving plenty of time for discussion at the end. So I might just briefly start with just giving an outline of NCAD's project and contribution to Our Many Europes, After Effects and Untold Histories, and where this sits in the wider Internationale project. Our Many Europes is a 4-year programme which focuses on the 90s, and the 90s is a decade that really shaped contemporary Europe as we know it now, with the end of the communist rule in Europe, new technologies, all creating a new sense of globalism. And this 4-year project, which is sort of manifested through the work of all the partners, is really looking at how the art of the period reflect those fundamental shifts, and very critically how they are still affecting us now and the kind of legacies of that time within our contemporary experience. And NCAD's project and contribution to Our Many Europes is a particular focus on where the sort of intersections of politics and performance come together, looking at that in the context of Ireland, but also through this 5-week programme, inviting speakers from across Europe to bring some of the sort of research we've done into Irish practices into a more global context. And so this active research project has kind of 2 aspects to it. First of all, we commissioned, and this sort of work started in 2019, through the funding that came through as being part of the Internationale, we were able to commission a really significant body of research by Dr. Kate Antosik, apologies, Kate, your pronunciation of your name, Antosik Parsons, and Kate will be speaking later on in the programme. And Kate's research did two things. It mapped the activity that was happening in Ireland at the time, and also very critically where documentation and information and the history of that lay, because it sort of sits across a number of private and institutional archives. And then from that work, she undertook 11 very detailed interviews with a range of practitioners from across Ireland that she identified as whose work from that time really kind of spoke to some of the core themes, thinking a bit about post-conflict politics, body politics, and the legacy of the church's role and the instruments of the state in Ireland, and how that kind of manifested in practice. And these interviews are an amazing kind of primary research tool now that sits within the NIVAL archive and will be there for students and researchers for generations to come. Aspects of them as well have been shared online through this project, and as I say, Kate will also be talking later in the programme. But I think it's really important to stress that our aim was never to fix that history. There's still an awful lot to be understood and unpicked and uncovered, and that's where this kind of 5-week programme comes about. And it's been curated and thought about very much in the framework of uncovering new conversations about this time and inviting contributions from people across the sector and from our students, from our audience to reflect and bring their own perspectives as we kind of build and understand that history. So that's, I think, enough talking from me, because we've got lots of people here. So just to, as I say, to give an overview. So I just wanted to now kind of bring Annie into the conversation and ask Annie in particular to just maybe speak about the background to the Internationale, because I know, Annie, in your previous role as curator in Van Abba, you were one of the people very instrumental in the establishment of the Internationale. And I wonder if you could just talk about some of the ambitions of the project at the beginning and what you think have been some of the kind of key outcomes that have come through a number of years now of this group working together.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and thanks. It's really exciting to be here at the launch of what I think is going to be an amazing few weeks of thinking and talking together. So so appreciate the invitation and the engagement and our collaboration on this. Yeah, I mean, I definitely, I wouldn't say I was necessarily instrumental in the setting up, but I was one of the people who benefited enormously from this relationship, and I hope definitely contributed to it over time. And that is, it's hard to explain what it is, because we know a lot of European, there's these broad European agreements and often very bureaucratic, but also quite interesting attempts to kind of link ourselves with other institutions, whether they're universities or museums, or we try and get ourselves part of a program that expands our knowledge and network. And that's definitely something that I think in IMMA, all of us have done to a certain extent, to push on and drive on certain elements of research of what we do. I think what was so extraordinary about the Internationale, which actually now is in its third, if you want to quantify it, or if we want to quantify it by EU applications, it's in its third application. The very first one was one which looked at the sort of post-war avant-garde, so starting in kind of 45 and going right up to maybe that moment of postmodernism. And then a second one was kind of really trying to understand a moment of the uses of art. And then this is the third iteration. And the reason I say that, and the reason I think about its many developments, is that the longer the relationship has been going on between all of the museums and really the directors and the people, it's always about people in the end who kind of drove this process, the richer it's become. And I'm sort of so excited to see how much this network and this set of thoughts and these quite radical institutions, I would say, across Europe are thinking together and sort of developing thought. And so to that end, I suppose it is, to me, more than we might often think a large European network is on some levels, because there's a group of very sort of committed and inspirational directors, I think, who started this. And they were kind of a lot of the people who kind of really imagined, if we want to think about institutional imagination in the 90s, new institutional thinking at a moment that was, kind of quite important for all of us. It was the end of postmodernism, the beginning of a kind of global thinking, the fall of the wall, and this moment of globality and understanding where we were coming and emerging out of a very Western-centric idea of modernity and specifically post-modernity. Into a kind of a much more, I guess, what we understood as young professionals, exciting period, where the world was to be explored and reconfigured, and also the passages and the connections and the kind of cultural traffic was also to be reconfigured, as were the power relations. And so a lot of those directors, namely fantastic directors like the director of the Reina Sofia, the Muka, Van Abba, where I was working, the wonderful Moderna Galleria in Ljubljana, which to me is so inspirational, with Zdenka Banovic, SALT in Istanbul. And these people, before they constructed a kind of network, were amongst a group of curators who are really trying to think beyond a kind of deconstruction of or an institutional critique. They were trying to imagine institutions in Europe. Now there's a broader group. You could think about people like Maria Lind, even Hans Ulrich, or many others who were kind of engaged in a very energized debate about what art institutions and the organizational and the curatorial capacity around art could be. And somehow it segued. So some of those directors were kind of friends, I would say, but definitely colleagues, respected colleagues. And there was this interesting moment when they were kind of coming together with that first Internationale group, where they were, I think, looking at what was happening with the survival of museums, what was happening with the mad explosion of the art market in the 2000s. And I remember at one point, some of them saying things like, well, we could follow the model that is the Guggenheim or the Tate, which is a kind of giganticism. Is that the model? Is that the way in which we survive, or we increase our footprint, or we fight for the sector? Is that politically a good way to go? Is it, I mean, even in terms of resourcing, really those questions about the scale of those models and what they could do. And then we were even watching things as we got through the later 2000s, like the whole United Arab Emirates sort of development around art, and the New York, the new university in New York, or the Louvre. They were literally franchising themselves and their ideologies and their thought processes out and implanting themselves. So there was kind of neo-colonial kind of thinking going on around institutions that was gigantic and really super ambitious, but no less quite problematic, and allied to a very neoliberal idea of the business model. And so I think these directors were rightly questioning this and sort of thinking, could we really go back to those very important questions about collaboration, even about communism or the commons or socialism? So could we look to all of these places and understand what it might be to be in solidarity with each other and communicate as maybe national bodies, or at least civic bodies, in service of the polis now? And I think those very kind of, often they're very organic, very simple questions, but really important for these large scale institutions. These were the questions that they were asking. And to that point, they were sort of thinking, well, we could be a confederation. Maybe we don't have to be gigantic or franchise ourselves out or become bigger, too big to fail, that kind of model, which is, of course, a classic neoliberal model. But perhaps we could really think, what if we pooled the resources? And that became, sorry,
no, carry on. I was just going to say, I think there are a couple of things there that, from watching that from the outside, that was so striking, is that idea of gaining strength through collaboration, but also a kind of bravery to create a framework through colleagues could come together to ask each other quite difficult questions and sort of work through these difficult questions of what it means to be running a museum now. What is the role of the museum? What's the relationship of that museum to the audience? And to step into quite unknown spaces, but see that collaboration as a way of approaching those questions and trying to find some kind of shared understanding.
Absolutely. And I think there was an intellectual friendship there in a way, you know, as well as, and they all had their different scenarios and their different countries to deal with. But there was a commitment to trashing out those difficult problems that I think stood the test of time. I mean, it's not like it was easy or clear. I mean, there was often stage. I remember my director, Charles Escher, when I was in the Vanaba, would say things like, well, we might know what this is after 10 years. We certainly don't know it after the first 5, or we were kind of all rubbing up against each other. We even got some kind of corporate analyst guy in at one point to ask us, to try and help us think through how to work together. And he said, well, effectively, if I look at it on paper, you're all in competition with each other. we were sort of like, you know, on paper.
It can be the mindset of museums. It can be a very competitive space, and this
absolutely
kind of
yeah
a real alternative to that, and
yeah.
are willing to kind of even the commitment to share collections and support resources and see the resources of the museum as a kind of open source.
Exactly. And I think, and that's where probably people like me came in. So we're at the level below. We were the curators and, you know, in charges of collections and temporary exhibitions and education. And for us, it was the peer-to-peer kind of communication and being able to explore projects, and certain projects sort of drove particular ideas. Like we started a whole project called Art Utile, and it eventually resulted in with Tanya Bruguera, which resulted in the publication, The Uses of Art. But again, we would find commonalities and drive each other on in relation to different things. And sometimes we were apart, and there was something great about even that. We realized we did not have to achieve consensus. We just had to kind of debate and think. And so I remember the artist duo, Bick van der Poel, saying to me at one point, God, it's amazing. You can be in Eindhoven, but you can stretch a limb and kind of connect to Ljubljana or Istanbul. And I think that was it. There was something extraordinary about the idea that the longer and more we got to know each other, the more the critical questions we were all dealing with could be in dialogue with each other. And that seemed really precious. And that again was a counter model to not only that kind of franchise model or that neo-colonial model where we were just implanting ourselves everywhere. What was so liberating, I think, there, and started a lot of those conversations even about decoloniality, as well as other kind of interesting conversations, was the idea that we could be precise about where we were. Mm-hmm. So, you know, the postmodern moment, and I still remember hearing somebody from the Tate talking about this, and I never forgot it. She was saying, well, I think we can agree in postmodernism that we're all internationally equivalent. And of course, that's what, you know, Brian O'Doherty so brilliantly looked at, this idea of the problems and the technique of the white cube as this utterly autonomous space. And of course, there was something joyful and global in the idea of imagining we were all in a shared space, and the white cube meant it was universal. But I think Internationale worked really intelligently to combat that idea of complete, you know, tabula rasa, universalism, the old modernist sort of paradigms, and really think, no, but actually, if we would understand our aesthetic languages and our cultural languages from where we are, always bearing in mind the global conversation and always dialoguing with each other and understanding these kind of really important seismic shifts globally as well as locally, we might get somewhere really exciting. And so for me, just, and again, we'll jump into this, I'm sure, the idea of Ireland coming into this, knowing what it did for me in the Netherlands while I was in it there, was so exciting.
Well, I wonder exactly where I wanted to kind of get to, because I think that kind of that pull between the engagement and real responsibility to your specific context while being part of a global conversation is a very, very interesting dynamic, one not at all just being about the focus on the global. And for me, so to sort of give a bit of background and to sort of where we got to this point, when I was director of IMMA, so going back to sort of 2017, the Internationale network, and I know very much driven by you, Anine, as I see Ireland represented within the program, very generously sort of reached out and invited me to attend one of the meetings to see where about IMMA and Ireland becoming part of the partnership. And I think what was for me such a strength and such potential for Ireland was the ability of Internationale to uncover and bring focus onto very particular forms of practice that perhaps had sort of sat hidden in different contexts, and bring them into this international conversation. And we discussed a lot the importance of that happening in Ireland. I wonder just if you could just be interesting just to sort of get your perspective on that, for somebody being curator outside of Ireland for such a long time. But I know always, and it's something we've talked about a lot together, this, you know, that we feel there's a lot of work that's happened in Ireland that over that perhaps hasn't had the focus it should have, and why do you think
Yeah.
that happened? And
For sure. I mean, yeah, I mean, I can only, I suppose, speculate from both my own sense of where I was in the Netherlands and my own experience coming there, that I didn't see the Irish aesthetic experience or expression as part of those big global dialogues enough. And I didn't even know myself how to articulate them. Maybe that was the point. And I wondered whether that was part of us or me or whatever, a language in which I was being trained in when I came up in Dublin in the mid 90s or early 90s, where I felt I was always trying to place myself in that international equivalence rather than understanding perhaps the symbols and the aesthetics and the ways in which it might be articulated at home. And I didn't quite know how to place that.
yeah.
And I also found it extraordinary how little people knew about Northern Ireland when I was in Europe, or, you know, I mean, there's a fantastic, we're doing a summer school in a while, and Beatrice Colomina, you know, the famous sort of architectural theorist, is going to talk at it. And she sort of, I remember her telling us at one point that there was, as far as I remember, I hope I have this right, that there was a really interesting group of architects who were trying to look at ideas of the mechanics and the architectural sort of technologies around the peace walls in Northern Ireland as in the 70s, 80s, sort of, I suppose it would have been more the 80s and late 70s, as part of an international dialogue. And it was actively stopped. You know, there were levels of sort of censorship and securitocracy. It's not for no reason that we didn't feel like we could articulate these things, you know, and it's that ability to kind of be precise and to allow that into a dialogue, into a narrative that felt dominant, which was obviously Northern Europe led, secular, you know, so even the aesthetics of Catholic sort of technologies and modernity, which we might have more in common with Spain or Portugal or Poland, then perhaps the places that we were sort of looking to, which were the States or Britain. There was no space for that, and I didn't certainly feel like I had a language for that. And now I feel like this network has sort of allowed that. So that's where I was really excited. I thought this space could give us that. And not to mention, I mean, Ireland, all of these places are relatively small. We feel like at a certain scale, when you get into institutional life, where do you go? Where do you dialogue? And so I've learned more from my colleagues in Turkey or even in Muka, you know, which would have been sort of, you know, an hour up the road, because you can stretch your capacity and you can talk about it's peer-to-peer discussion, but at a level that feels very secure. And so I think for institutions, it's really healthy as well, that you really develop these kind of dialogues.
So when I say, coming back to the kind of 2017 moment, when I entered the kind of the fray and it feels like another age now, where we all got on a plane and flew to a city and had in a room together talking face to face, and another world. But you know, I was very delighted and very honoured to sort of join one of the bigger group meetings to discuss the next phase of the Internationale project and this idea of the 90s. And we very quickly aligned around a conversation exactly as you say, like, where can we find the space for this Irish practice in that, and this idea of some kind of manifestation in practice to thinking about the relationship of the church to the state, and the Irish experience of that, and where that sat in the network, and making connection, particularly aligning with colleagues from Poland. And that's a key aspect of our project. We're working with colleagues in Warsaw around exhibition they're planning later in the year, looking at some of these issues, but where the experience they're living through now has a kind of very interesting kind of historical relevance to it when thinking about Ireland from this period.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I mean, there was a few, you know, often what happened with the Internationale, I remember we did the previous iteration, we looked at the long 80s, we called it. And it, you know, partly like with most things, you know, it comes from a people's sort of troubling of certain ideas, and then you realize there's synchronicities. And this time there was that. We were really interested in thinking about body politics. You know, we were watching this really exciting time in Ireland in relation to the referendum. We were looking at artistic voices leading that, and I'm sure that's so much part of this dialogue. so exciting, like the notion of how artists and kind of contemporary culture impact on the civic space in relation to foregrounding and imagining another possibility somehow. And so we'd kind of done that a little bit with the 80s in a particular way, because we were all just sort of developing stuff around that in the previous iteration. And this time it was, I think it was Ferran, who was the director in MAGPA, said something very beautiful around the idea, but for us who are old enough, or certainly for me who's old enough, that this, you know, we have this urge sometimes as museums and maybe universities to historicize something that is exciting to delve into in the past, but this is still within our lived history. And there's something very difficult about tackling something that is so familiar that it's kind of, you know, hard to step back, because maybe everybody's still around, or maybe everybody has different dialogues or narratives around it. And that idea of like what performance was doing as a political moment as well, which was possibly in the expansion of the art market and all those things kind of resisting, you know, which I think obviously people like Peggy Phelan and others have written so brilliantly about. So there was, yeah, it was, and then just to ask that question in Ireland seemed really prescient, because you just knew that so many people who were driving a lot of the great Repeal the Eight dialogues, etc., or people like Mick Wilson and Paul O'Neill and others who are really tackling kind of abuse from the church, or sort of state sanctioned abuse, or I mean, you know, there was really very visionary, very tough and interesting kind of performance practice going on there that was challenging and exciting.
I think we both acknowledged, you know, that our own roles as curators at the time, you were in the Douglas Hyde, I was, we were both young curators, frustrated assistant curators in two institutions across Dublin at the time, but that I was in IMMA, you were in the Douglas Hyde, but we, as you mentioned already, we were sort of focused on the international, and we weren't necessarily looking to what was happening within practice in Ireland, and our own institutions' relationship to that practice was very distant.
Very distant.
And it was happening in the spaces outside, and that's been one of the interesting things that's come through in Kate's research, that a lot of the really interesting work that was happening was coming out of NCAD, it was coming out of the project, it was coming a lot of artist network spaces and festivals, and that looking back on it now, I think, why didn't I know those things were happening? Where was I looking? What was I thinking? And as you said, that kind of, that view to the, and I know that's something, thinking about IMMA's 30th, that you're reflecting, and we'll come to sort of later in the program. I think that kind of, say, that pull between the local and the global, and the responsibility of the institutions to the local, and to holding that history and revisiting it, which I'm conscious of my job as chair, which I'm not already going off my allocated time frame, because I'd love to talk to you about, and we have talked about these things, Danny, and we can keep talking about it, but I think that it might be a good moment to sort of bring in Johanne and Jennifer, just to think, as I say, that because one of the exciting things for me about this research project and the importance of it is kind of capturing, even in Kate's really fantastic interviews, capturing a whole range of knowledge and work that otherwise just is gone, because it's not sitting in,
it's not an object.
It's not an object. It's not sitting in collections. It's not in the history of exhibitions. It's not in archives. And one of the things we really wanted to sort of look at within this project is the role of the collections in archives like NIVAL's, which is an artist-led archive, in holding these histories. So it might be. So Jennifer, I think you were going to start in particular.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Annie. It's really pertinent, Annie, that you mentioned this idea of a lived history, because when you think about performance art and the documentation of performance art in Ireland, if we take 1972 as the first kind of formal presentation of performance art by Brian O'Doherty in the project as a starting point, then performance is approaching a 50-year history, and so many of the practitioners are still alive, and are, as I want to explore today by looking at some images that I've selected from the archive, they're still source material. They are the you know, the primary source for information about documenting performance and collecting it. So what I plan to do is just give you kind of a brief little view to some of the, I think I've selected, not for today, but 53 images in total that will feature on the NCAD in public website as part of After Effects. So I'll just give you a sense of that today with a few slides. I'm going to be looking at this context of setting the scene for performance art in Ireland. So actually going back a little bit further than the 1990s and looking to maybe what was happening in the 70s and 80s. How did Irish art kind of get to, Annie, as you described, this kind of global sphere? How did we participate on that in a kind of more minute level by looking at maybe some of the instances of performance that were happening, how artists were connected through these kind of very convivial networks internationally, and then also how they collaborated with each other. So if you just bear with me a moment, I will pull up some images for you. Okay, wonderful. We'll just go back to the start. So for those of you who don't know or haven't visited NIVAL, as Sarah said, we're based in NCAD, and the acronym stands for National Visual Arts Library. We are a public research resource, even though based here on campus, so we're open to everybody, anyone who is interested in researching all forms of Irish art. We collect and store material, and we make it accessible, so that is really our mission statement. Our holdings on performance art can consist of, printed material, and so that might be the starting point to look at retrospective publications produced by artists themselves, such as Nigel Roth's archive publication or BBON's performance art in Northern Ireland. And of course, any starting point would have to begin with Anya Phillips's edited publication, Performance Art in Ireland, A History, which features really interesting essays by academics and artists looking back at the kind of history of performance, not notably a single history, but the various kind of multiple histories of performance, given that it's such a difficult subject to write about, and one that is very much kind of finding its feet in terms of the historiography of what was happening. And so that's why projects such as this are so important to recognizing that. Well, then within our NIVAL, we would also have a lot of files on individual artists and organizations, as well as special collections. So of note here might be Brian Connolly's special collection that he donated to us in 2015, or collections on organizations such as City Arts or the Artist-Led Archive would house really interesting material on performance activities. So to note then that the material, when it comes in, as you can see in these images here from the Women Artists Action Group, largely unprocessed, so arriving in big boxes. And so it's our job to kind of put some order on the material without making explicit the artist or the archivist's hand in doing that. So how do you, present something in a kind of a less confused fashion that is accessible and usable? And so there, as well as printed material and special collections of archival material, it's also useful to bear in mind that there are so many wonderful digital resources out there for researching performance. The recently digitized Alistair MacLennan archive at the Duncan of Jordanstone College of Art and Design in Dundee is a fascinating and wonderful resource. It's just going on live, and I think they're actively adding to that in the coming months as well. And the DeMarco Digital Archive is another great resource for Irish art. Richard DeMarco was a Scottish gallerist and very prolific organizer of events in the 70s and 80s, of which he organized tours, or pan-European tours, that included Ireland and often kind of involved Irish artists who were either performing in Edinburgh or in Ireland. So that can be another resource, even though these online archives might be located outside of Ireland, they do hold material that is relevant to the study of Irish performance histories. And then obviously indexes such as Lux Online are also really important for Irish artists who maybe have lived abroad for a long period of time and might be represented in British online repositories, such as Anne Tallentire is featured in Lux. So then if we just skip forward to these two images, I selected these because they're from the Richard DeMarco archive, and they also kind of highlight, what might be considered the two founding fathers of performance art in Ireland. Typically, the beginning of a scene for performance is accredited to the arrival of Nigel Rolfe and Alistair MacLennan to Dublin and Belfast, respectively, in the mid-1970s. These images are interesting in the sense of one being performed at NCAD. So I don't know if this is widely known, if this image has been seen before. It's great because quite often the same images of performances kind of get circulated and they become quite iconic. So it's really interesting to see something that, you know, hasn't really been seen before. And this is Nigel Rolfe performing for that group of tours that I said was organized by Richard DeMarco. In NCAD, and it's called open hand, closed fist. So he's using these kind of quite, you know, primordial body language gestures of an open hand, maybe typically associated with reconciliation, and a closed fist associated with aggression in this kind of space of a table where maybe, you know, people might sit down and, you know, negotiate their conflicts or work things out. And he's drawing on these kind of quite, I suppose, simple metaphors, but, you know, considering what we've discussed about the project of Internationale and what was going on globally and the kind of political ideas that were, you know, circulating, it's interesting to kind of consider how this might speak back to that. And then similarly, Alistair McLennan's As Is performance here is a great, I selected this because it's a great jaunty shot taken by Richard DeMarco himself. So that archive comprises of thousands of what could be considered snapshots. And he typically used two cameras, one with black and white and one with color film. He didn't use a lens or focus his images very well. And that required him to get quite close up to the performers, kind of also becoming a performance in itself in the way that he interacted with the performers and documented the images or the works as they were ongoing. So if we talk about iconic images of performance, and this might be one, this is Nigel Rolfe's zebra performance at Project in the late 1970s. And as I mentioned, Nigel Rolfe is kind of, you know, maybe one of the founding fathers of performance in Ireland, and so in the terms of setting the scene. And it was really following his appointment as director of visual arts programming at Project that he took this opportunity to organize two programs of performance, expanded performance, sculptural installation at Project, which took place over the space of 5 weeks. And one was called Time Space Performance Installation, and then the other was called Dark Space. When I spoke to Nigel Rolfe about this work, he wanted to highlight to me that, you know, he conceived performance at the time as kind of a complete cycle. So it would take up to 12 hours to set out the lines of soot and flour on this bed here, and then maybe 30 minutes to perform, and then hours to clean up after the performance. But when Rolfe was conceiving of the work, he wanted it to be a complete cycle of performance. And so I think this kind of highlights how the image, while it's iconic and it's only really a moment in a performance, and it can't really capture the whole duration of the work, including those non-public elements that are part of the work when the artist conceives them. And so these venues such as Project, obviously, well, other ones such as Grapevine Arts and Art and Research Exchange, Catalyst Arts, these were really important sites for performance, and you see a lot of activity happening. And it's possible then within the files in NIVAL to trace these activities, to look through the organizational files and to try and map out, as Kate did when she visited NIVAL in preparation for her interviews, to try and map out a kind of a sense of what was happening, who was participating, how were things funded, if that information is known. But outside of this kind of maybe, for want of a better word, institutional structures, performances were happening on the streets of Dublin, on these kind of, in these, you know, non-organized sites. And I have an example here from Nick Stewart. I really like this image. He provided me with a better quality one. There is one in the file in NIVAL, but he recently provided me with this, and it takes place on the pedestrian island on Oconnell Street Bridge. And this is quite a kind of an important site within the city of Dublin, because the river bisects the city, and it really is a demarcator of north and south of the city. And during this time, it's performed in 1982, so Stuart had just finished, he just graduated with his fine art degree from Belfast College of Art, where Alistair MacLennan was so active at the time. And during this performance, he gathered water, I think it was 25 cans of water from the Lagan and the Liffey rivers. And he created these series of water-based drawings on the pavement that very quickly evaporated over the space of obviously 8 hours, and he would redraw them again. At the end of the performance, then he drew a map of Ireland in chalk, and he doused himself in water from both containers. So this is kind of interesting because it you know, he's using these kind of simple reference of north and south, the Lagan and the Liffey and water, but really to kind of speak of complex issues of, you know, identity and territory. And I think you can also see that in Anne Tolntar's Altered Tracks performance. In this work, she used 3 voices, her own and a voice of with a British accent and a voice with an Irish accent. And she walked barefoot along the gallery floor, along charcoal lines on the gallery floor, and placed stones along the lines. As she walked, the lines became more blurred. And so in the act of kind of creating, she was also erasing. And these actions of kind of physical tracing, demarking, I think, again, they speak to these themes of blurring of identity, given that, say, Anne Tolntar had moved to London and has since resided there, but originated from Ireland. And so she's kind of raising these ideas of how does one assimilate into a new culture? What part of you do you carry over? What part do you change? These kind of ideas. Another image then that I've drawn from the archives is Frances Hegerty's ablative dative genitive. And this is an important example of how artists in the 80s were engaging with performance, but alongside film or video work. And so it kind of highlights the beginning of a change of attitude towards installations that not only were housing performance, but also where the production of film was conceived as part of the work. So the work was originally proposed for a festival called 3 Days of Live Art at Art and Research Exchange. So again, identifying this venue is so important in the history of tracing out performance activities during this time. And in the files, I was able to locate Frances's original proposal for the festival, which outlined what she intended to do and how it would be realized. So if we look at these 2 images as documents of an event, you have one that was produced in advance of the performance, but is now an actual kind of record of what she intended to do. And then you also have an image of the live action. So the performance element itself for this work consisted of 10 large freestanding frames with drawings. And then during the course of the performance, she burst through the paper-based frames and kind of reiterated actions that were described in the film. So then, as I mentioned, Art and Research Exchange was a really important venue. And it kind of brought together a lot of artists from Ireland and from Poland, international artists such as Władysław Kazimierczak and Artur Tabjur. And I think through these connections, further opportunities then for performing internationally were arranged. So we see 2 images of from the Brian Connolly collection here in NIVAL of him performing at Irish Days, and then also Sandra Johnson performing in another work called Scouring at Irish Days too. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Connolly did donate a really large collection of material, and it's full of really fascinating images here in NIVAL. It's about his performances and his exhibitions, where he worked, who he collaborated with, and then there's also lots of interesting information about his public art commissions as well. And so while this one is derived from a special collection, the other image is actually provided by Sandra herself recently in the context of Aftereffects. And so this highlights how our ongoing engagement with living artists is so important to the work that we do here in NIVAL. We would actively encourage artists to check their records, to contribute new material as they continue to practice, but then also to newly contribute historical material to make sure that, you know, we have a really good extensive record of their career over time. So I think what's clear from these examples of, you know, a near 50-year history of performance in Ireland is that it's very much a living history. Many practitioners are still working today. And so the need to archive information about performance is so timely, especially if we consider the role that artists play as the primary source of material about their activities. More often than not, and I've found this through personal experience, artists are best placed to kind of correct and update information about their own work, to describe how events were, you know, organized, how they were funded, through whom, what the deep connections are there. And so if artists are the only source of information about their past events, prioritizing artists then in this way as this kind of embodiment of their own archive can also, you know, lead to more instances of fallibility, given that, you know, a lot of these works took place in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and how well can artists remember if they didn't practice really good record keeping at the time. And so I think it does highlight the need to, you know, continue to grow collections around performance art, not only of documents of performance art, but also all the ephemera that goes with performance art, to kind of create this almost second resource outside of artists' individual memories and collections, to bring all that together. And so take, for example, if you take Brian O'Doherty's name change performance, which Dorothy Walker in her Flash Art article identified as the first public performance seen in Ireland in 1972, where he officially changed his name to Patrick Ireland. Let's consider the actual material traces of the original work. So this is housed in the permanent collection of IMMA. And what we're looking at here is a kind of a series of images produced after the performance event by O'Doherty, in this kind of conceptual art grid format. So we see images on the top and hand painted drawings on the bottom, including this copy of the signed agreement that officially changed his name to Patrick Ireland. And then when we look at the kind of follow-on performance that Patrick Ireland delivered to revert his name to Brian O'Doherty in 2008 at IMMA. First of all, the images are of much better quality, but also the event, the way it's organized, in the images that Fionn McCann provided to me for the purposes of After Effects, there are lots of photographers and videographers depicted kind of jostling for the best angle to record the event. And so it's interesting to highlight how, you know, two performances by the same artists that are linked thematically, and what documents of that are present. And of course, we would have a lot more information about the subsequent performance here in NIVAL. It was well covered in the media and in the press, and also it was really well documented by photographers. And so that's just kind of an interesting comparison maybe to end on, considering that we started with the very first performance, and then he, you know, subsequently produced this one. So then if we consider on a whole the types of document about performance art in NIVAL, it's very diverse in format, but it's also quite diverse in what it describes. As a collecting institution, we're very interested in capturing this, what, you know, Rolf referred to as the complete cycle of performance, the preliminary work that happens in advance, as well as that which comes after, so that it can be stored and kept for posterity. There are many types of documents that constitute a record, including but not limited to ephemera, sketches, notes, proposals, images and footage, as well as secondary source material in printed books and journals, as I showed at the beginning. So although there are gaps in the type of records available to us, we're very hopeful that we can keep adding to this collection through our relationships with living artists and with artists' estates. And so at this point, given that we've just talked about you know, performances at IMMA, it might be interesting to turn over to Johanne to talk a little bit about institutional collecting practices of purchasing performance even where, you know, maybe no residue or little residue of the work or trace remains.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jenny. And yeah, Joanne, hand straight over to Joanne.
Sorry, jumping in. Thanks, Jenny. It's I'm always so jealous whenever we start looking at NIVAL's documentation and archive. For what we're striving for at the minute. So it's really timely that we're having this conversation, and it's actually great to kind of be able to get this opportunity to stop and pause, because we're in the middle of a very intense acquisitions process at the minute, where we're collecting our first live performance works. Unfortunately, it's not next week because we can't announce the works until next week, but it's obviously, it can be discussed during the run of the program, which should be so it's really exciting for us as well. So the part of the but I'll try not to say challenges and issues and problems too much during the next few minutes. Obviously, there's a wide range of challenges when we're collecting performance, and I mean, Jennifer's just outlined quite a few, just in terms of documentation of what's existing, artifacts, what is the object, what is kind of whether we have I suppose documentation of kind of earlier performances in particular, or it's building up that artwork identity is always a challenge. But if one of our projects over the last few years that has probably helped us in the kind of process of that we've got to at the minute was the digitization, our archive digitization project. So Sarah was well aware of this project. It was the funding was secured just as you were leaving for NCAD. And so it was secured in 2017, 2018. So it was one of these daunting projects that has been discussed over a long time, especially in terms of our documentation of the program, performance work, or time-based media collection. So one of our focuses for the Digitize, we secured the money from the department to carry out a digitizing archive and digitization project for the museum's collection and the program. So half it was kind of divided, and half was documenting the collection in terms of the artworks, and then the rest was looking at the artworks, time-based media artworks, but also looking at the program, the archiving the program, documents and exhibition program. So the museum has always had a quite strong performance links. Our first 41 works that were purchased by the collection data include performance artists, Nigel Rolfe and Blood and Beast from 1990, but not live performance at the time. So one of the focuses for the project was a large focus was looking at the time-based media archive, and we had worked with Brian Castriota, who's a time-based media conservator. He also has a lot of experience working with drawing up contracts with performance, collecting performance and creating identity reports. So he's been phenomenally helpful just in terms of our process of kind of reviewing the archive of the performance based works and program, and also looking at the acquisition of the live performance works that are coming into this collection. So Jenny, sorry, I know you're controlling the slides. Thanks. So one of our, as I said, the performance was quite featured heavily in the program from the early days. One of the first solo exhibitions in the museum was by Alana Kelly. So the exhibition was in 1992 and was called The Country Blooms a Garden in a Grave. It was really kind of examining and exploring the kind of cultural scars of the famine in a really contemporary backdrop of the contemporary backdrop of global famine at the time in the 90s and prevailing. So this work came from the 1992 series. It's called Sanctuary Wastelands, and it's work in the collection. So it was shown as part of the Glenn Dimplex Awards in 1994, And the work came from the 1992 series. It was very much a performance conceived from a performance by Alana. So the performance was took place in Templedough-Moor, is outside Lewisburg in Mayo, and it's the Church of the Great Sandbank in Mayo. So it is the burial mound that was originally a 6th century monastic settlement, but then became a famine burial ground in the 19th century. So it was also then known as the sanctuary in 17th century, referred to by 17th century map makers, and then became known as the Wastelands after the burial. It became the famine burial ground. So hence the name Sanctuary Wastelands. So the original performance, Alana circled the mound, keening for the dead. So the mound that you can see on the projection here has been eroded now by, it was beside on the beach, and still had remnants from the burial. We showed the work in Lewisburg as part of the national programme, maybe 2003 or 4. And at the time we had Alana came to give a talk, and the talk was packed, and people from around the area that had played in the mound whenever they were children. There was people that had relics of tooth from the mound, and it's completely eroded now. But I suppose it's one of these works that has always really interested me since I started working in the museum, just in terms of its identity, the artwork identity. So it was originally conceived as a slide tape installation. So as three slides, or three slide projectors. So one, the still image was of the mound was projected, with two then revolving slides that would dissolved in. You can see the focus. There's quite a close up of the mound that disappears through this slide, comes in and out. The sound, the original sound as well, was of Alana Keening herself. So it's one of these works that it has changed identity because it's now a video piece. It's been shown as a video piece since 1998. So the work it was made, like I said, in '94, shown as part of the Glennie Award, which Alana subsequently won. The work then was purchased in '97, and it was shown again as part of the national programme, but it was shown a few times, and there was a lot of technical difficulties just with the slides were sticking, and it was proving quite problematic, and that kind of spurred Alana on to transfer the work. She wanted the work to be transferred to video. So it's kind of interesting in a way, because it was a work that was already in the collection when this decision was made, and it was very much a conversation between Alana and Catherine Marshall and Declan McGonigal at the time. So, and we have great kind of resource material and letters back and forth, and with the digitization company and the slides, and so there's a kind of wealth of information there. But it was also, I suppose it's how the identity changes, and I suppose the same for performance work, a live performance. If the performance is reenacted, how the history of the work is recorded, and how what's the true essence then of the piece. So it's the slide, as I said, the sound was Alana Keening. And at the time when she was transferring the work from slide tape to video, she also decided to change the soundtrack. So she worked with Martin Hayes, and it's probably more of she's still keening on her voice is still included, but it's probably more of a global soundtrack. So in a way, while the imagery is is similar. The work in terms of equipment and sound is very different. I've never seen the original slide tape work, and we did for a while lose the original sound, which we found thankfully as part of our digitization project, so that was very welcome. It was safe, but it was hidden. So it's just that there is something that we're exploring at the minute as well, just in terms of building up that identity. So which is the true work, and how do we capture this? How do we capture if a work is performed 3 or 4 times? And unless, as Jenny has alluded to as well, unless an artist or institution or organizer is very fastidious in recording every step, the history can maybe be skewed. So the work. Oh, sorry, we'll go on to the next one. Thanks. Oh, sorry. Thanks, Jenny. So this 2 images here are, one is of Signed in the Depths by Louise Walsh and Pauline Cummins, and the other work is Joan Jonas, Revolted by the Thought of Known Places, from 1992-94. So the Signed in the Depths is from 92. So I suppose this is kind of showing in terms of the programme and the importance of the residency in the museum. From the beginning, Jackie McGonigal, the founding director, had always spoke about process over product, that he wanted to make sure that the artist was very much working on site, that the process was paramount, that performance was always integral. It was there was no, for the artists could work on site, but we're not going to be forced to produce. So part of the early residency was we didn't have at the minute we have the building, or the building that runs along the old stables, that runs alongside the reception area, is the purpose-built studio space, but that was built in 94. So before that, there was still space for within the galleries, maybe in the East Ground galleries, which would have had been used as artist studios as well. But at this, Louise and Pauline at the time had been interested in working together, and had been talking to Declan about the possibility of showing work that they were still conceiving, which was Signed in the Depths. So the exhibition was just before Alana's exhibition in 92, and they both spent time working in space. They both spent time working in the museum. I was speaking to Louise recently. She was saying they were allowed to run amok in the gallery, in the museum, and there's this. So hopefully we still have that essence. Artists hopefully can still run amok. So I mean, this work it's one of the many powerful feminist works produced at the time. And as I said, it was 92, so it was very much in the middle of the debate around the X case, where it was still illegal to travel to obtain an abortion. The work is multimedia piece, but very performative. You can see the still image on the left is the mouth projected onto the female body. This is the video at the sunshine in my house. Video piece that's kind of integral part of the installation. So the installation is made up of full installation is made up of video, light boxes, and still images. So the video here has this it's really releasing this laugh, this female laugh. So it's a kind of building of laughter, really laughing down the patriarchy. It's a really powerful piece that I have never seen. So I've listened to the video, I've seen the still works in the the light boxes, but I've never seen it installed. And like Sarah says, it's our 30th anniversary this year. So we're working on the Narrowgate exhibition, Narrowgate of the Here and Now. So it's the 30 years of the global contemporary. So Signed in the Depths is going to be included in the show. And I think I'm speaking to Louise and Pauline, they're a little bit concerned, wondering, will it stood the test of time? And I'm sure it absolutely will have. So that's kind of exciting at the minute. So Jonas, I just included this image because the work from the Stedelijk collection, and she had a research trip to Dublin or to Ireland in '92, and she was researching Heaney's, or Seamus Heaney's version of Sweeney Astray. So this was, she finished the work. She was interested in coming back to Ireland to work on to continue her research. So she spent time in the residency in 1994, and she would have actually been one of the first artists in residence in the purpose-built spaces. So we have quite a lot of correspondence between herself and Declan, and this is just a sample of one of the letters. Apparently she has a great affinity with Ireland, so we're hoping we can maybe draw on her again this year and bring her back into the programme. Sorry, Jen, maybe skip on. Sorry, I'm just looking at time. I better speed up. This is, as nobody needs an introduction to Nigel Rolfe. So there's a few images. Funnily enough, I had the archive, the archive publication, that an image in this slide, and when I looked at Jenny's, she had the image, and her image was better than mine. So I cut and pasted from the first slide and put it in there. So, but we have 4 works in the collection by Nigel. He was one of the first acquisitions that was talked about earlier, the Blood of the Beast triptych. So this is an image on one of the panels of the triptych on the bottom left hand side. It quite corresponds quite well with the earlier image Jennifer showed. So the other 2 works are from the 80s, so slightly earlier, but Dance Slap for Africa and Winds of Fear. So 2 of the works are photographic. One is the Dance Slap for Africa, is a 2-channel video piece of documenting its performance from 1983, and then Wings of Fear is a pigment drawing. So Nigel is, we have a long-standing relationship with Nigel. He's been really supportive and included, or has I think even since I worked on the national programme, a lot of the train exhibitions, he did lots of performances around the country. This is one just included from 2011, where he performed at the opening of the Inishkaltra Festival in Mount Shannon. Didn't know how it was going to go down, but it was pretty amazing. So the book, or our archive, the catalogue publication now that I've shown, is also from '94. This is it was part of the Beyond the Pale exhibition series. And the exhibition series, Jonas, after working in the residency, was producing work for that exhibition series. Well, actually, Sarah, you may have been in the museum at that time. No, beforehand. No, too early. So the archive show by Nigel, I think, was really a signal by Declan that to try and, as an attempt to, as he said, to try and historicize the process rather than the products of the last. So the project included a reading room with the video and audio works and documentation of the archive, and which was included in the contents of the publication. So it's full of sketches and drawings, and past 20 years before the previous 20 years. Okay. Oh, sorry, I'm getting a warning. Last one. Okay, finish up now. So Kevin Atherton, these 2 works by Kevin in the collection. So it's in 2 minds, is on the left here, from 1978 to 2014. So when lots of the discussions that we've been having are probably we're talking about unruly artworks. So unruly artworks is a term. It's not made up by us, but this is when we've it's been a recent term used to discuss collecting performance and ephemera, and try again to thinking of the work. I mean, it really does challenge every our traditional mechanisms for collecting. Our whole desire to future-proof and have everything very structured, but this, as I talked earlier about the identity of an artwork and trying to record that exhibition history, I mean, this In Two Minds is a piece that has had in numerous iterations and re-engagements and reenactments. So the work was originally performed in 1978 in Serpentine Gallery by Kevin Atherton when he was 27. And it's one of my favourite works in the collection. But it again was so during the years, Kevin has argued with himself, his 27-year-old self, in a variety of situations, either live performance and documented for, as we can see here, which the right-hand side panel is himself in 2014. The piece was filmed in IMMA as part of the Primal Architecture exhibition. And then it subsequently was purchased by the museum through the Hennessy Art Fund. We also have Timepiece, and as you can see on the right-hand side, this is a performance that Kevin originally conceived in 1974. And I suppose it's a good example of documentation. And this is the only existing image from that performance. So it's the Echo, the newspaper, but I heard him speak and kind of laugh about it afterwards, then why he was quiet. He didn't want his performance documented, and it wasn't what it was about, and it was in the moment. He was quite happy afterwards that there's one image existing of the original performance. So this is we have a copy of the image as part of the piece. And then on the left hand side, you can see he performs the work again for the opening of Primal Architecture exhibition in 2014. So I'm sure you won't mind me calling them unruly artwork, but trying to go back now and document every, it's ideally what we should be doing, and what we will strive to do is try and capture every engagement and reenactment, and just to really gather that essence. I mean, an issue that's coming up at the minute as well with collecting the performance work is duration, and the durational work that an artist may have a work that in the 80s or 90s that they may have performed for 150 hours consecutively. I don't think we're health and safety at the minute we're going to be able to do away with that. So all of the interesting conversations that we're having at the minute, and I'm very aware of time, so I'll finish now.
Thanks so much, Joanne, and thanks so much, Jenny. There's a huge richness there, and I'm conscious of opening it out to the audience. So we'll be using, as we're in a webinar scenario, it's through the Q&A function. So please do type into that if you have any questions, and we can address them. A couple of things I wanted to pick up on, just while we give people time to reflect on that. I think what is so clear, Joanne, and it's the need for museums to adapt to practice rather than museums expect practice to adapt to them, and that being a slow learning. But this idea of the work not being accepted by the institution, that the work will change and have iterations and be a living piece and not come into the collection as a fixed point, that is quite a major shift, and it's taken collections a long time, I think, to get to that point. I don't know if you or anyone to.
It's oh sorry, Annie, do you want to go ahead? Lost my train of thought. Yeah, it's one thing that we have. It's just in terms of discussions about where the life of the performance as well, that the artist doesn't feel that the work has to, it cannot be reenacted by another performance artist. Will there be a score or not, or will the work, when the artists can no longer perform the work themselves, that will be the end of that iteration, I suppose. And that's just collections being able to, like you say, adapt to the practice, and that's okay, and that's, it's given that able to.
Absolutely. Maybe if I can just jump in there, I think what's really fascinating indeed is not only are institutions institutionalized, artists can also be quite institutionalized in some ways around, so I think that fluid dialogue around what it is, what Joanne was referring to, we're having really fascinating conversations about the idea, what happens to this performance in 100 years? What happens when because I'm really interested in, if we, you know, I really value the archive, and I would say one of the reasons I decided to come and look at the museum was because I'm dying to think the collection and the archive in a very lived way through a contemporary lens. So I think this is really important. But I love the idea of like collecting being the essence of the work, right? Whatever that might mean. And so what if it is the performance itself, like, and what happens, and often indeed, I mean, even that comment, Joanne, about Kevin saying, I wanted it to be in the moment, you know, honoring that, but also thinking, okay, but what, Kevin, if you die, or what if we want to buy this amazing thing that should be in, how do we keep the essence of this work in the same way that we can with a sculpture or a painting? They're kind of fantastic, mind-blowing challenges in relation to how are we honoring the National Archive of Artwork as museums, you know? What is our role there? And if maybe they're collaborative works, or they're politically sensitive works. So art historical time and real time are just mind-blowingly different. And what do we do?
And then that actually leads very well to the first of our questions from Tom Creed, and it's a very good question. I think have the panelists have had experience of acquiring actual performances rather than documentation of them, in the way that museums have acquired work by Tina Segal and Roman Adank, for example? I mean, I can speak to working with Tina Segal, not acquiring the work, and he isn't, as you say, Annie, this thing of artists adapting to institutions as much as institutions adapting to artists. And Tino is somebody who's put a huge element of his practice is how that relationship with the institution works. And even staging a performance with Tino is about an economic contract. It's about hours in labor and how those hours in labor are distributed, and the processes required to kind of bring the teams in place to do that. And for him, that's the practice. It's that negotiation. So you are negotiating from the beginning around a budget, a set of parameters, and a very, very fixed process of delivery. But I presume these questions of acquiring actual performances, some of the things that you're dealing with now, and I know you can't name the works, we're all intrigued, but
yes is all I'm saying. Yes, and it's amazing, like it's mind-blowing. It's like, you know, it's we need to think the legality, we need to think, you know, the what kind of contracts, what kind of political legacy is there, you know, what were the intentionalities then and now in all of those. It's so exciting. And yes, in the VNABA we did collect performance, and we also contributed to a research with the MoMA and the Tate around all of this, just trying to think what it is, like, again, what is art historical time and what is real time, and how do things resonate, and how do we shift our behaviors in order to allow these things to happen. So yes, watch this space. We'll be making an announcement soon, but I think I could say, maybe without revealing too much, I think we're buying at least 4, if not more, performances as performances.
But I think it also, but even there's the performance as performance, but I think everything that everyone has said today really echoes the importance always of the work around that.
Of course.
You know, the context into which all things come into the collection. And Joanne, I think the examples you gave showed that so quickly, really understanding the changes that happened to a work and why, and the decisions that were made when pieces were acquired, all that correspondence. And I think back, and I observed this to you both, you know, I was in the exhibitions department in IMMA for a long time now, was probably the worst archiver in the world, and I still
I'm that
like the amount of things I put in a bin because I didn't have time or the energy. So just there wasn't that understanding of the kind of institutional history and the importance of those institutional histories. Another question.
Download your brain, sir.
Sorry?
You just need to download your brain now instead. It's payback.
Probably inconclusive. Another question here. Thank you for this engaging conversation. Thank you very much. I would like to ask Jennifer what she considers to be gaps in the NIVAL collection, and how NIVAL proposes to address these gaps. Well,
no small task. I think maybe some of the gaps might be around the kind of preparatory work for performance. It would be very interesting, you know, to see more of that in the form of notebooks or sketchbooks that performance artists might keep. I think there was a reference to that in one of Kate's interviews with Danny McCarthy. I think might keep notebooks in preparation for his work. And I mean, it's a perfectly viable means of documenting your thoughts for, you know, painters to keep a sketchbook, or you know, so why can that not translate to performance artists as well? And I think we would love to see more of that type of material in the holdings here. How do we plan on addressing it? Well, I mean, I think through activities such as this, you know, I mean, it's about, as I said, we're very much a living archive. Our engagement with living artists, you know, and it's a reciprocal relationship. We contact artists to invite them to contribute more material, and then also artists in giving their material to us feel that it is, you know, it's safe, it's in safe hands, and we can then act as custodians for that. So I guess it's just about keeping those ongoing relationships active, seeking more opportunities to disperse information about what we do and share our collections online would be another angle that we would hope to spread information about.
And I think also, and I mentioned at the beginning, NIVAL is a very critical part of NCAD as a kind of site of our research activity, and that's something we really want to develop in the coming years. So this whole program will be archived and become part of NIVAL, and I think I'm really interested in how NCAD as a research institute can kind of facilitate these conversations and rethinkings and reframings, and through that encourage the material into archives. So it is into NIVAL. So it is this constant reach out, as you say, Jenny, for people to kind of come to us and engage with the archive. Yeah. Lauren Kelly has a question. Like to ask NIVAL about taking new archives and how new can they be? I suspect this may be one of our students. Can a recent student submit their performance, and how does the National Archives of Ireland have a copy, which is a oh, Lauren, it is one of our, it is Lauren, I know Lauren. It's one of our amazing graduating students who's working in performance. And Lauren, I would say very good to be thinking about this very earlier in my career. I was working in the Henry Moore Foundation, and one of the most striking things I will take from that is that he started archiving his work as he was a student. Showed an incredible, you would raise questions about his sense of self and ambition, but it was, as a resource for future art historians, was an extraordinary move.
Yeah, I mean, in response, I think, you know, just to say we're always very open to new approaches of material, and we're very democratic, so we don't really distinguish between how established you are in your career, or, you know, whether you've met any kind of external criteria of acceptance that might be out there in terms of, you know, your artistic, you know, status, let's say. So as a democratic archive, we're here, we will accept material. The best way of doing it is just to make an approach and have a conversation, and let's have a dialogue and see, you know, if it fits.
Could I say something? Just, I mean, it's a little quizzical, but I'm sort of a little fascinated by it. If we want to think about the cultural conditions of the 90s, and even what you're joking about, and me, Sarah, about our disastrous archiving, sort of personal archiving policies, I really think that there was a very political energy around that in the 90s. And I'd love to think about that at some point, maybe as a broader project, that there was a deep distrust of art history as something deeply conservative. There was a deep distrust of the institutions like museums. There was an explosion of the idea of working, you know, not only can we say the global biennales and working indeed, as we said, in the interstices of different places, but there was a sense of not wanting to be documented according to the Bernard Berson sort of, you know, sort of art historical model that I think perhaps maybe our generation inhabited too. And that's where these projects are so important now. So while we can sort of point to our own personal failings, and I definitely own up to those, I think there was a political impetus to it too, that I think, you know, has a legacy that's quite problematic. I'm trying to move all my books and stuff over at the moment, and everything's a leaflet or a thing in the moment. And now, like, as the art market has expanded again, you know, everything's a book or a magazine, or even galleries are producing, you know, libraries of things. So there's a really interesting idea about how we understand the deeply important nature of what you're doing at NIVAL now.
You're right, and actually one of the interviews, Brian Hand's interview, which is so fascinating. They're all brilliant. I would encourage everyone to engage them online. But he talks about this kind of anti-establishment that was evolving out of NCAD at that time. There was, you know, and he was particularly involved with the Blue Funk group that was so influential, but of which they have almost existed in mythology, you know, because of the lack of documentation of the work, but this kind of anger around how they saw the institutions serving them as young artists and wanting to exist in that alternative space. And you've mentioned, Jenny, like Catalyst and, you know, the Artists Exchange in Belfast. They were such important institutions that were operating separately to the official space, to the arts councils, to the, you know, IMMA newly established, but the publicly funded spaces. And I think there also was a desire on behalf of the artists to place themselves outside of it, partly through lack of recognition as well. But you know, that there was a real divide and two spaces into which things were happening, and that kind of leaflet, ephemeral approach and temporality of the work, things appearing and disappearing.
Yeah, absolutely. I was asking myself the question of, well, there is quite few documented instances of performance in Ireland, you know, in the late 1970s. And does that mean that the performances weren't happening if you can't find the document? Or is it a case that actually there was a very rich culture of early performance in Ireland? It's just that for Annie, as you've said, you know, maybe for various reasons, artists just did not recognize the value of keeping a record at that time, or they chose deliberately not to. But at the end of the day, you do kind of revert back to these art historical methodologies when you're writing a history of something, you know. So these important
of course, I think it's
of date and time and knowing what happened. You'd love to be able to write outside of those methodologies and maybe introduce something else, but
I don't know. I think it's a deeply political project to historicize our histories and what we find important. There's a huge power in it, actually. And I think I'm totally committed to the idea of the archive. I mean, what I think unfortunately has segued weirdly is that embrace of anti-institutional kind of and deeply political behavior, which was to not be categorized into a kind of neoliberal embrace of only the present. So in a weird way, there's been, you know, which is a highly ideological in a very problematic way, which is always about being in presentism. And so unfortunately, I think that has reduced us on some levels and stopped us from understanding the language of the past in a very precise way. Hence the importance of the archive.
And I think it was interesting, Joanne, I mean, I'm so glad to see that Sounding the Depths is going to be shown, because it's a work that's existed through fragments, but, you know, and has not been shown. And that question of and concern of Louise's at Pauling's of would it stand up, I think it's so important that it is reshown in this framework, because I think there's also just the context in which Louise and Alana and Pauline were working at that time, and our understandings of the context in which they were speaking to is so completely different now. And I think that will be very interesting in that restaging of that. And as you say, Annie, the importance of kind of going back to those moments in history and really reinvestigating them and understanding what was being said and what do we know now. We know so much more about what was happening in Ireland at that time. That period pre-90s was before so much became really explicit and openly talked about. It was hinted at, it was kind of veiled. And I think to see that work again now with the knowledge that we have is really critical. So absolutely stands the test of time. It's kind of, you know, fundamental to revisit it. And as you say, Annie, move out of this kind of obsession with the now, the present, or the future. I'm getting flagged at about time. I'm seeing one more. Sorry, I'm not doing my job. I'll take one more question. I know Jenny might be kicked out.
We're waiting for the shepherd's crook, Jenny.
There's a, sorry, I'm just can't read this very well. What is your experience when researching into specific artist work when you have to negotiate with institutions and archives such as LADA and Boris Nielsen's Black Kit Archive? Was that question related to anyone in particular, or might be a little bit more specific?
I think it's working with our archive just in terms of researching ourselves. I've always found very open. The problem access in terms of digitisation.
Yeah.
And much archives, especially at the minute, if you can't travel and you can't, you know, and even going into to spend 72 hours in between picking up a piece of paper and passing it on to somebody else. So it's that would be the main block, would be digital access.
An openness, but just the accessibility of
exactly.
material is the.
I mean, by and large, I've found archives, online collections, special collections that are based internationally, really open to collaboration. You know, particularly in inter-archival collaboration, you know, where there's this potential to share information about collections. And I think most of the time it can only really benefit the project, the work that we're doing, if we share information with other archives, with other institutions, if we collaborate, because there's no point in us all being siloed, you know. We can maybe
also share some of the questions, share expertise, as we come back to the kind of one of the functions of the Internationale project.
Absolutely,
kind of cross-disciplinary teams that work across the institutions looking at these issues. I think we are at our time, and I'm just checking there don't seem to be more questions. So thank you all very much for your questions. I wish we could see everyone. It's so weird. The group of people you can't see your faces, but thank you all very much for joining us, and thank you all so much for your contribution. We could carry on. Well, luckily we have a couple of instances through the program to carry on talking about these issues, and myself and Annie will be sort of back at the end, kind of closing the program. But I just actually want to flag also that Kevin Atherton is one of our panelists and will be performing as part of the program. So it was great to see his work, Joanne. And I want to flag also Maria Fusco is doing an amazing performance tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, which will be on the NCAD YouTube channel called "For God's Sake, Bring Me a Large Scotch." And one of our more recent graduates, Maya Nunes, who's an amazing young artist working in Dublin at the moment, is undertaking especially commissioned work later on. I should know all these dates, but later on in the program, and it's all on the website. But there's a number of so over the next 5 weeks, there's events every week for the next 5 weeks. So please do stay engaged, and thanks so much everyone for your contributions. And we're so excited to see what's going to happen over the next year with the acquisitions and the plans for the collection. And congratulations on that amazing acquisitions fund as well that's enabled those purchases. It's so important. And I know from my own, as Joanne will know, pain of many years of not having sufficient funds for acquisitions. It's so great to see that finally coming in to IMMA. It's so
fantastic. And also thank you and thank NCAD for just, you know, heralding this amazing project and bringing this Internationale relationship so importantly and meaningfully to Ireland. I think it's great.
Well, I feel it's the part of a long relationship. So anyway, lovely to see you all. Have a lovely evening, and thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye.